What's up, nutrition nerds, and welcome back to another video. And today is part 2 of the Train High, Sleep Low video. By the end of today's video, you're going to have a much better idea of whether this training strategy might be beneficial for you. So let's get stuck in. Alright, so this is part 2 of the video, and in this one we're going to explore and expand on the last video to give you some more information. And if you haven't watched part 1, then you really should. I've linked it at the top of the screen for you now. But for those of you who have, let's crack on. So we went over a study which seemed to show some really positive benefits. But do all of the studies looking at this method seem to suggest it's as beneficial? We're going to run through a few more studies which follow this train high, sleep low, or periodized carbohydrate approach, and see if they were equally as good. So the first one is by a team led by an Australian lady called Louise Burke. If you don't know Louise Burke, she's a fantastic figure in the world of sports nutrition, and she does a lot of awesome work to push sports nutrition in a lot of different areas. Louise and her colleagues investigated the effect of 3 different diets over a 3-week period on performance: a normal high carbohydrate intake group, a periodized train high, sleep low group, and a low carbohydrate group for the whole period. And they did this on 21 elite race walkers. Now, if you're wondering if a study on elite race walkers can translate to you, it's very likely that it can. We know from lab testing that these race walkers are working really hard, and they're using energy in the same way as me or you. So, what did they find? In the high carbohydrate group and the periodized carbohydrate group, they found that on average they improved by about 6%, but there was no significant difference between the two groups. The low carbohydrate group actually got worse, but that's a topic for a different day. Their results showed that there was a similar improvement on both a high carbohydrate and a periodized carbohydrate group, suggesting that neither diet was superior for training and performance. On to the second study, and this was by a group of researchers led by Carl Holston. They also compared training in a low versus high muscle glycogen state, but their method was a little bit different. They did their sessions in the same day with a gap in between, rather than an overnight sleep. And they also swapped their sessions around. So they did an easy low intensity session in the morning, restricted carbohydrates, and then performed their high intensity sessions in the afternoon in a lowered muscle glycogen state. Perhaps not the best method in my eyes, but nevertheless, their study showed some really interesting results. They also used a 3-week training block and did a final performance test of a 60-minute time trial. They found that both groups improved on average by about 10%, but equally with no difference between them. Again, suggesting equal benefits of a high carbohydrate diet versus a periodized carbohydrate diet. Now, I think there's 2 really interesting points in this study. Firstly, they found that in the high intensity training, the average power output was significantly lower in the train low or periodized carbohydrate group, highlighting that we need carbohydrates when it comes to high intensity exercise. And this is really worth remembering. And, you know, I kind of bang on about this as well, but it is worth knowing. Secondly, and this is a topic that we'll go over more in future videos, they measured the overall amount of fat contributing as energy during exercise and found that the proportion of fat providing energy significantly improved in the periodized group after the 3 weeks. While it didn't seem to translate into any performance benefit in the 60-minute time trial, it might be much more important when it comes to longer distance events. We know that in 60 minutes of exercise, carbohydrates probably shouldn't be the limiting factor. But when we go above 90 minutes, depending on your pace, we're considering half marathons or marathons, and all the way up to ultra marathons or an Ironman. This might be much more significant. In this study, there weren't any changes in weight. So the final study we're going to cover is by a group led by Reese. I think that's how you say it. Another 3-week exercise study where grouped either periodized carbohydrates or had a high carbohydrate diet. Their results were similar to the previous study. On average, the groups had a 16% improvement in performance, but no significant difference between the groups. Both diets on average had roughly the same performance increase. this team of researchers also looked at the amount of fat used in exercise, and they found that during the training sessions, the periodized group used more fat for fuel. But when it came to the final performance test in a time trial, there wasn't actually any sustained change in the amount of fat used for fuel. It only seemed to be an acute response to the low carbohydrate availability rather than maintained. And this team didn't find any changes in weight either. Now those are all the studies that I wanted to discuss. So I guess we've got to sum things up really, haven't we? Overall, we've got one study which suggests some real positive performance benefits using this train high, sleep low strategy compared to a normal carbohydrate diet, and 3 which suggest no difference. Importantly, none of them found any worsening in the periodized group. We've got 2 which suggest a weight reduction in the periodized group and 2 with no changes. And we've got 3 that showed in some way, shape or form in the study, the amount of fat the participants used as fuel increased. But this didn't necessarily translate into performance benefits. So judging off all of that, it seems like it could be a really good method to use. We just probably don't know enough about it yet. Which brings me on to a few points to highlight to conclude. There is a lot we don't know yet, and this is important. Not just in terms of endurance performance, but other aspects as well, including our health. Some studies seem to suggest that training with low carbohydrate availability before or after might increase the rate of bone turnover, which essentially means there may be a higher chance of stress fractures. And we know that training with low carbohydrate availability reduces our performance in high intensity training. So if you're aiming to really push it in those high intensity sessions, we need to be well fueled. And we don't know whether there's a difference between males and females when it comes to this approach, because unfortunately there's just not much in the way of female research when it comes to this. And because there are quite a lot of unknowns to consider, and that's not even all of them, it's quite hard to make specific recommendations. But I'm sure the question you want to know is, should you do it? If you're fit and healthy without any medical problems, then it might fit as part of your training. However, until we know more about it, this probably shouldn't form part of your normal training plan. Keep it to say a 3-week training block, which is away from your race season. The reason I say that is the closer you get to your races, the more specific that your training needs to be to that race. And it's unlikely that this particular strategy is specific to your racing. It's also the time to really focus and nail some good sessions. So playing around with low or high carb intake, in my opinion, isn't something which you should be doing. But if you do decide to try it at some point, you need to make sure that you keep your carbohydrate intake up at the times that you are eating them. Essentially, you need to eat the same amount as you normally would, just in a shorter time frame, to make sure that you're adequately fueling your high intensity training. And on that note, it's important to say that you need to just make sure that your overall calorie intake for the day stays high. There's a tendency with any type of fasting to reduce the amount of calories that you eat in a day, which is something we really want to avoid when we're training hard. We need to make sure that we eat enough to fuel the training and then also recover. I think that just about brings us to the end of this topic. It's been a big one, but I hope you found it interesting and useful. I'd love to hear any comments what you thought about it. Now you have a bit more understanding about the topic as a whole. And as always, I'd be really grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And make sure you press the notification button to stay up to date with what I release. And I'll catch you next time. See ya.